Born to a mad father, married off at 6 and sent away to become queen of a foreign land. This is the shocking and heartbreaking story of Isabella of Valois, wife of Richard II and England's youngest ever queen consort. Stay tuned to hear what their bizarre marriage was like, how she handled her husband being deposed and likely murdered, her second child marriage, tragic end, the desecration of her grave, and why Shakespeare's portrayal of her bears little resemblance to the real girl. Isabella of Valois was born at the Louvre Palace in Paris on the 9th of November 1389, not the current building which now houses the famous museum, but a predecessor of it. Her father was King Charles VI of France, a man who was famously mad and at one point believed he was made of glass. Her mother was Isabeau of Bavaria. Isabella was their third child, but her older brother and sister had either died before her birth or soon after it, and she was the first to survive infancy. She was followed by 9 more siblings, of whom 7 lived to grow up. There are stories that Isabeau was a neglectful mother, but in actual fact, her accounts show that she spoiled her children with books, pet parrots, and other gifts, and she and Isabella would always remain in touch with each other, even when separated by large distances. By the way, if you'd like to read more about Isabella's life, one of the sources I read for this video is an edited volume called Later Plantagenets and the Wars of the Roses, which I'll leave linked in the description for you. Negotiations for the little princess's marriage began when she was an infant, not unusual for the time, and she was initially engaged to Jean, the son of the Count of Alençon. In 1396, however, she was betrothed to Richard II of England instead, who was on the marriage market once again, having lost his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, in 1394. Richard was born in January 1367, making him 29 years old in 1396 to Isabella's 6. Nevertheless, in the interests of promoting peaceful relations between England and France, this was all happening against the backdrop of the on-again, off-again 100 Years' War, and perhaps to prevent Richard marrying Yolanda of Aragon and therefore making a Spanish alliance, the marriage negotiations were allowed to proceed, after Richard had turned down 3 other French princesses who weren't the daughters of the king. Historians have questioned why a childless king would have been willing to take on a wife who would surely not be able to provide him with an heir for many years, with some arguing that a platonic marriage suited him because he was in genuine mourning for Anne of Bohemia and not looking for a proper wife, in inverted commas, to replace her just yet. Others say that he sought to emulate Edward the Confessor, who, it is supposed, by some at least, did not consummate his marriage to Queen Edith, preferring to live a pure life for religious reasons. All Richard really said about it was that he felt he was still young enough that he could afford to wait for children, and as he himself had become king at 10 years old, perhaps he took a different view on such early elevation to majesty than most of the rest of us would. We'll never truly know, but you can share your take on his motives in the comments. As part of the negotiations, the contemporary French chronicler Jean Froissart, who also spent considerable periods of time at the English court, tells us that the Earl Marshal of England, who was Thomas Mowbray, 1st Duke of Norfolk, and the king's cousin, Edward Earl of Rutland, went to France with several other lords and ambassadors to, quote, treat of a marriage between King Richard and the young daughter of the King of France, who was not then more than 8 years old. According to him, there were doubts amongst the French privy councillors about the wisdom of giving their princess to the English, given the fractious nature of the Anglo-French relationship in recent decades, but they were talked around in the interests of peace. The ambassadors were given permission to see Isabella, and Froissart gives the following account of this meeting. This had been at first refused, for the council excused themselves by saying that she was but a child, and that at her age of 8 years, she was actually 6, remember, nothing could be judged of what she might turn out. She had, however, been well educated, as she showed the English lords when they waited upon her, for when the Lord Marshal had dropped on his knees, saying, "Madam, if it please God, you shall be our lady and queen." She replied instantly, and without anyone advising her, "Sir, if it please God and my lord and father that I be Queen of England, I shall be well pleased thereat, for I have been told I shall then be a great lady." She made the Earl Marshal rise, and taking him by the hand, led him to the Queen, who was much pleased at her answer, as were all who heard it. The appearance and manners of this young princess were very agreeable to the English ambassadors, and they thought among themselves that she would be a lady of high honour and great worth. Everything went well, and a marriage alliance was agreed between King Richard and King Charles. Given her age and the state of canon law at the time, Isabella could theoretically have repudiated this marriage that she was about to be sold into when she reached the age of 12, as could Richard, by the way. Nor was it to be consummated until she attained that age at a minimum. But as it would transpire, neither issue would ever come into play. As part of the marriage treaty, England and France agreed a 28-year truce, and Isabella was given the extraordinary dowry of 800,000 francs, 300,000 payable upon the marriage, the rest in instalments of 100,000. If she did refuse the marriage, very unlikely given how livid it would have made her family back home in France, then Richard would get to keep the entire amount. But if he rejected her, he'd have to return twice that. Furthermore, Isabella was to have 500,000 francs from this dowry for herself, but if she had daughters and no sons, then she'd lose out, for the entire 800,000 would be used for those girls' dowries when their turns came to be married. The couple's children were also to have no claims on the French throne, and Isabella was to get £6,666, 13 shillings 4 in lands per year from her new husband, which was much higher than the £4,500 worth of lands usually given to English queens in this era. These lands were comprised in part of holdings which had been owned by the now deceased Earl of Pembroke, and included Pembroke Castle in Wales, where Henry Tudor would later be born. With the paperwork complete, it was time to make the union official. The first step was a proxy union on the 12th of March 1396, in which Isabella was married to Richard despite him not actually being there. Instead, Norfolk stood in as his proxy. Again, we have an account from Froissart, who wrote that she was betrothed and espoused by the Earl Marshal as proxy for the King of England, and the lady ever after was styled Queen of England. I was at the time told it was pleasant to see that, young as she was, she knew well how to act the Queen. When this business was completed and the different treaties signed and sealed, the ambassadors took their leave of the king and his court and departed from Paris to Calais on their return to England, where they were joyfully received by the king, the Duke of Lancaster, and the lords attached to the king's person and pleasures. Later in the year, Richard himself went to France to collect his bride. Whilst there, the issue of her age did come up between him and Charles VI while the pair were dining together. However, the King of England brushed it away, saying, "Good father-in-law, the age of our wife pleases us right well. We pay not so much attention concerning her age, as we value your love and that of our subjects, for we shall now be so strongly united that no king in Christendom can any way hurt us." With that, they concluded their meal, after which it was time for the official handover of little Isabella from her father to her husband. Froissart's Chronicle provides an image of this meeting and says that the young Queen of England entered the tent, attended by a great number of ladies and damsels. The king led her by the hand and gave her to the King of England, who instantly after took his leave. The queen was placed in a very rich litter which had been prepared for her, but of all the French ladies who were there, only the Lady of Coucy went with her. For there were many of the principal ladies of England, such as the Duchesses of Lancaster, York, Gloucester, Ireland, the Lady of Namur, the Lady Poynings, and others of the nobility, who received Queen Isabella with great joy. When the ladies were ready, the King of England and his lords departed, and riding at a good pace, arrived at Calais. On the Tuesday, which was All Saints' Day, meaning the 31st of October 1396, just days shy of Isabella's 7th birthday, the King of England was married by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Church of St. Nicholas at Calais to the Lady Isabella of France. Great were the feastings on this occasion, and the heralds and minstrels were so liberally paid they were satisfied. It's worth noting at this stage, another source, the St Albans Chronicle, says the marriage occurred on the 4th of November, so it's up to you who you choose to believe. Froissart is known to have made mistakes on occasion, and perhaps this is one of them. Either way, though, the bride wasn't quite 7 years old, and was now England's youngest ever queen consort, a dubious title which she still holds to this day. The St Albans Chronicle also tells us that for the handover from Charles to Richard, she wore a blue velvet dress decorated with fleur-de-lis and an expensive crown on her head. A few days after the wedding, the following Friday according to Froissart, Richard and Isabella set sail for England, where its new queen was to start the next chapter in her young life. Before I reveal what happened to her next though, if you're enjoying what I do here, please do consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss an upload. It's entirely free to do, and it helps YouTube know that you like my content and that it would be a good idea to show it to other people too. You can also join my YouTube membership for extra perks, or find me over on Patreon where I release even more bonuses, including early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. The link is below for you, as is a link to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads by signing up to my free mailing list. For those of you with Irish ancestry, you might also want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon, and details are also below. A little over 2 weeks after her arrival in the country, Isabella was formally welcomed into London, accompanied by many great lords and ladies. She spent one night in the Tower of London, then processed through the streets the next day towards Westminster Palace in great pomp, meeting Richard there. The Londoners gave her great presents to welcome her, but unfortunately some were crushed to death in the rush to see her. I doubt Isabella knew much about this though, and it didn't dampen the celebrations. A tournament was organised at Westminster to be held at Candlemas, and she was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey on the 7th of January 1397. Isabella was installed in Windsor Castle and given a staff to care for her, including the aforementioned Lady de Courcy as a governess, while some others were inherited from Anne of Bohemia's time as queen. She also received jewels to wear which reflected her status. Again, we might assume some of these had once adorned Anne, just as the much later Tudor consort necklace was worn by at least 4 of Henry VIII's wives. I'll leave my video all about it linked for you. She also took part in some of the standard duties associated with queenship despite her youth, including petitioning for pardons for convicted criminals from her husband, though one imagines the names were chosen for her by others, as it's hard to believe she was able to hear the cases and make a reasoned judgment about who to intercede for. As for her relationship with Richard, given the age gap and the fact that she was just a little kid, this thankfully took a paternal bent on the king's part rather than anything romantic. He spoiled her with gifts, including additional beautiful jewels, such as an engagement ring of sapphire and ruby, and she reciprocated with presents to him, but again, it's hard to imagine that this 7-year-old was really directing the creation, selection, or bestowing of these items. She was devoted to Richard though, by all accounts, and I imagine she viewed him as something of a father or older brother figure. If you're wondering how they communicated, by the way, Richard was actually born in Bordeaux, and although he spent most of his life in England, he certainly spoke French. There is little else to say about Isabella's queenship, partly because she was so young and partly because she was queen for such a brief period of time. In early 1399, as Richard prepared to set off for a campaign in Ireland, he apparently dismissed Lady de Courcy, who was suspected of getting above herself and stealing the Queen's possessions, and installed his niece, Eleanor Holland, Lady Mortimer, in her place. I say apparently because the Chronicle of Saint-Denis says that Isabella actually lost her French retinue after he was gone, thanks to the intervention of the council he left in charge of the country while he was away. Before he left in late May, Richard and his little wife had what looked to contemporaries like a touching farewell, though to our eyes it's pretty uncomfortable, for reasons which will become immediately apparent when you bear in mind that Isabella was 9 at the time. A French chronicle called La Chronique de la Trahison et Mort de Richard de Roi d'Angleterre said that he, Richard, then took the queen in his arms and kissed her more than 40 times, saying sorrowfully, "Adieu, madame, until we meet again. I commend me to you." Thus spoke the king to the queen in the presence of all the people, and the queen began to weep, saying to the king, "Alas, my lord, will you leave me here?" Upon which the king's eyes filled with tears on the point of weeping, and he said, "By no means, madame, but I will go first, and you, madame, shall come there afterwards." Then the king and queen partook of wine and comfits together at the deanery, and all who chose did the same. Afterwards the king stooped and took and lifted the queen from the ground and held her a long while in his arms, and kissed her at least 10 times, saying ever, "Adieu, madame, until we meet again," and then placed her on the ground and kissed her at least thrice more. And by Our Lady, I never saw so great a lord make so much of, nor show such affection to a lady, as did King Richard and his queen. Great pity it was that they separated, for never saw they each other any more. Afterwards the king embraced all the ladies, and then mounted on his horse. It's tricky to know how to view this, but I'm going to give Richard the benefit of the doubt here and say that this was still his paternal side coming out. Certainly he doted on his wife, but there's no indication that he was a creep, if you catch my drift. Isabella was miserable for weeks after he left, and hoped to join him across the Irish Sea as he had promised. However, these plans were soon overtaken by other events. Richard had, in 1398, exiled his paternal first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, to France, where Henry even spent some time with Isabella's father, Charles VI. As for the reasons for this exile, let's just say that Henry and Richard had had a difficult relationship for many years, in part because of Henry's clear designs on the throne, but I'm not going to get sidelined into details of it here, as this is, after all, a video about Isabella. All that mattered from her point of view was that in late June 1399, Henry left France and came back to England, taking advantage of the fact that Richard was out of the country and had taken most of his loyal retainers with him. Never a good idea, by the way, in the medieval period. At first he said he was just there to reclaim his lands, but events moved swiftly, and soon he had gathered up significant support amongst the English lords who disliked the king and favoured a deposition. A deposition is exactly what they got, and it had life-changing consequences for Isabella. Richard returned to England in late July and found a kingdom in which resistance to Bolingbroke had already essentially been broken. Unable to offer any meaningful opposition to his cousin, he ended up in Henry's custody by the end of August and was sent to Chester, then Westminster, then the Tower of London. At first it seemed that Henry was just going to assist Richard in ruling, but that facade didn't last long. Richard was forced to abdicate his crown on the 29th of September in favour of his cousin, who became Henry IV, and the new reign was confirmed by Parliament the following day, with Henry crowned on the 13th of October. It was the action which would set off the Wars of the Roses, but to learn more about that, you'll need to watch one or more of my videos about that conflict, which I have a playlist on, linked below for you. What this all meant for Isabella was that she was no longer the queen. She was initially held at Wallingford Castle, but in January 1400 she was moved to Sonning near Reading, and evidently kept in style if the £400 ordered for her expenses by the new Henry IV in August that year is anything to go by. There were attempts to restore Richard early in the year, during which she was appealed to by the rebels for her assistance, but they were quickly put down by Henry, and in any case, Richard died under suspicious circumstances in Pontefract Castle, where he had been moved, on the 14th of February 1400, the rumour being that he was starved to death. Isabella was now a widow at the age of just 10. So what would become of this little girl now? Under the terms of her marriage treaty, she ought to have been sent home to France with a hefty portion of her marriage dowry totaling 200,000 francs and much of her property, including jewels, but Henry IV couldn't afford such an expense, and was in any case interested in keeping her as a bride for his son, the future Henry V. Charles VI refused this new match for his daughter, and when it was put to her, despite her youth, she showed great spirit and loyalty to Richard, who she doesn't seem to have known yet was dead, and refused to countenance it as well. This was important because she was closing in on her 12th birthday, when she would have been able to give consent, or not, to a union, and it would have been tricky to force a Princess of France, and arguably a Dowager Queen of England, into another marriage against her will, and not risk that marriage being declared void as a result. She continued to be well treated by the new king, and was housed at Havering at Bower in Essex until eventually, after much wrangling, the terms of her return to France were agreed upon. On the 21st of July, she arrived home, dressed in mourning blacks for the husband she now knew was deceased. She got to take some of her jewels with her, but the part of her dowry which had already been sent to England was never repaid. Despite her widowed status, the fact that she was child of 11 meant that she was sent back to her mother Isabeau, who she had not seen for going on 5 years. As for the future Henry V, by the way, who had been suggested and rejected as a second husband for her, he would end up marrying her little sister Catherine many years later, making them the only pair of sisters to have both been Queen's consort of England. Catherine then became the grandmother of Henry Tudor through her second marriage, and I'll leave my video all about the appalling treatment of her remains in Westminster Abbey over the course of several centuries linked below for you. I was able to find remarkably little detail about the rest of Isabella's life, but the broad strokes of it are known. On the 29th of June 1406, when she was 16, she entered into her second child marriage, though this time it would be the groom who would be considered the youngster. He was her 11-year-old cousin, Charles Count of Angoulême, who later became the Duke of Orleans in 1407, making Isabella its Duchess. The youth of her second husband no doubt explains why it was several years before she became pregnant, but she did eventually conceive in December 1408, which would be less than a month after her husband turned 14, the youngest age a boy was allowed to sleep with his wife, and on the 13th of September 1409, at the age of 19, she died, giving birth to her only child, a daughter named Jean. She was buried in the chapel of Notre-Dame de Bonne Nouvelle at the Abbey of Saint-Lomar, now known as the Church of St. Nicholas, and stayed there until her body was rediscovered in 1624 and moved to the Orleans Chapel in the convent of the Celestines, Paris. Her grave was later destroyed at the time of the French Revolution, so that today there is nothing left of England's youngest ever queen consort. Her daughter grew up to marry in 1424 John II, Duke of Alençon, who was the son of Isabella's first fiancé, and died herself in 1432 of an unknown cause, having had no known children. Isabella's second husband lived until 1465 and had 3 more children by his third wife, including Louis XII of France, who was briefly married to Henry VIII's sister, Mary. Isabella herself has made comparatively little impact on either history books or in works of literature. Arguably her most notable appearance in historical fiction also takes great liberties with her story, for when William Shakespeare came to write his play on Richard's life 200 years later, he presented the little queen as a fully grown woman, perhaps balking at the idea of having to put a 6-year-old on stage and feeling that the whole situation was just too distasteful, even for the later Tudors, who remained used to the idea of child marriages for royal and aristocratic ladies. That brings us to the end of the story of England's child queen, Isabella of Valois. Used as nothing more than a pawn from a shockingly young age, she was queen for less than 3 years and part of a marriage which raised a few eyebrows even in the 14th century given her youth. But ultimately, and tragically, it was all for nothing. Remember to let me know in the comments why you think Richard was content to marry such a young bride, and before I leave you, you'll be happy to know that not all child brides had endings as dismal as Isabella's. For 2 examples of other girls who were married off at 12 but did much better, See my videos on Lady Margaret Beaufort, grandmother of Henry VIII, and Christina of Denmark, who managed to dodge becoming that king's fourth wife. If it's the Valois family you really want to stick with though, then see my video on the remains of Isabella's sister Catherine. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.